My name is Alex Traiman, and I am the Jerusalem Bureau Chief and the CEO of Jewish News Syndicate, JNS.org. And I'm certain that everybody is wondering what in the world is going on in Israel. There are hundreds of thousands of people protesting out in the streets as we speak, many against the judicial reforms proposed by the coalition of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And in fact, there are also now, for the first time, at least tens of thousands of counter protesters that are in favor of the judicial reforms that are being proposed by Benjamin Netanyahu. We were going towards an absolute standoff in recent weeks that really hit a crescendo in the last 24 to 48 hours. And the breaking news from this evening, just in the last 2 hours, is that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has now announced that he is actually going to pause the entire judicial reforms package, at least until the Knesset session that will be after the Passover holiday. So we're going to go into a parliamentary recess soon. Netanyahu had intended to pass the judicial reforms ahead of the Passover recess. This was definitely leading to a lot of pressure inside the country. And now, after being urged by members of his own party, as well as members of the opposition, Netanyahu is now going to pause the judicial reforms. We'll talk a little bit about what are the reforms, why are there protests, what are the stakes, what's been going on. What led Netanyahu to make the announcement was that today, for the first time, the General Histadrut, the labor union of Israel, announced that they were going to have a general strike. Universities closed, hospitals closed, with the exceptions of the emergency rooms, banks closed, malls closed, and for the first time we've seen since COVID, actually, flights were no longer leaving Ben Gurion Airport because the labor union controls the airport, and flights today out of the country were canceled. So if you wanted to leave the country today, you couldn't do that. So in addition to the hundreds of thousands of protesters, we were actually starting to see the country shutting down, roads being blocked, the main highways being blocked, entrances to Jerusalem, the main Jerusalem-Tel Aviv highway, Tel Aviv junctions, the Ayalon Highway also being blocked. Things really hit ahead in the last 48 hours after Benjamin Netanyahu fired his defense minister, a member of his own Likud party, Yoav Gallant. Gallant had heard the cries basically from within the ranks of the defense establishment saying that reservists were not going to show up for duty because they opposed the judicial revolution, the judicial reforms. And he said that it weakened the defense of the country. Now, Gallant had wanted Netanyahu to pause the reforms and was scheduled to make a national address on Thursday evening. Netanyahu also wanted to make an address on Thursday evening, hoping to calm the tensions. And he begged Gallant to postpone his address, to not do it, to give Netanyahu's own address to the nation some time to penetrate the country and to see if things would actually calm down. And Netanyahu gave the address. We saw something happen in one of the protests in Bnei Brak, which maybe we'll get into it a little bit later, where the protesters went into a religious neighborhood, and the religious actually treated them with tremendous amount of respect, offering them food, cholent, ahead of Shabbat. And it seemed like maybe the tensions were going to calm a bit. And then Netanyahu went off to the United Kingdom to meet with Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister of the UK. And while Netanyahu was away, Gallant held a national address calling for the prime minister to urging him to pause the reforms. And he said that the judicial reforms were actually weakening Israel's security. So what Gallant did, on the one hand, was an act of insubordination, in that he challenged the prime minister, but waited for the prime minister to leave the country in order to do that. Had promised Netanyahu that he would wait before addressing the nation, and then didn't consult with him before going ahead and doing it. And also, you have the defense minister of the country saying that all of a sudden that the IDF is weakened by what's going on, which is a terrible message to send to the enemies of the Jewish people, the active enemies of the Jewish people. And Netanyahu felt like he really had no choice but to fire Gallant. Yet when he announced that he was going to fire Gallant, which, by the way, the official letter has not been given, it's just he announced that he was going to be firing Gallant, this set off even a further round of protests, a further intensified round of protests. Not that the protesters are big fans of Yoav Gallant, but just that the firing of Gallant was an escalation on the part of Netanyahu. And it seemed that Netanyahu was trying to quell rebellion within his ranks, and yet now, just not even 48 hours later, Netanyahu himself has been forced to pause the reform. So the question is, like, how did we get here? Let's go back to the beginning. And I actually think that the beginning of the story does not start with the proposal for judicial reforms, but we had 5 consecutive elections in the period of just over 3.5 years. The elections were primarily based on the one issue of whether Benjamin Netanyahu was fit to continue serving as Israel's prime minister. He had the parliament trying to block him with everything that they could put together to prevent him from forming a majority coalition. And they did 4 consecutive elections. And in the 4th election, not only did they block Netanyahu from forming a coalition, but the opposition themselves were able to cobble together a blocking coalition. The mandate belonged to Yair Lapid, but Lapid, who was the head of the left wing in Israel, was unable to form a government on his own. So he had to cajole Naftali Bennett, who was a member of Netanyahu's right wing camp, to defect from Netanyahu, and he offered Bennett the only position that he could possibly offer him to get him to defect from Netanyahu's camp, and that was the position of prime minister himself. So you had a right-wing member of Netanyahu's camp leading a coalition that included every single member of Israel's left wing, every left-wing parliament member, and for the first time in Israeli history, an Israeli Arab party, the Ram Party, which was not just an Israeli Arab party, but it was a self-proclaimed anti-Zionist party that actually is affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood. So while in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood is illegal as a party, in Israel, that party was part of this government. Now, what glued this government together was one thing: their desire to prevent Netanyahu from being the prime minister. And so when you have a diverse government that doesn't agree on much, what we found was that they weren't able to govern very long, and Bennett actually resigned almost a year to the day after he became the prime minister. Now, during this entire election cycle is when the protests actually began. You know, we had pretty harsh lockdowns during COVID. In the beginning of the coronavirus, Israelis were not allowed to go more than 500 meters from their house, except for 2 things. You could go to the store to buy food, or you could go to an anti-Netanyahu protest. And these protests had tens of thousands of participants. They were week after week after week. They took on different forms and different themes. So we saw democracy protests happening during the election cycles. You had what was called the Prime Minister protest, which is also a theme of the current protests. And Netanyahu was charged during these election cycles for corruption cases. I'm not going to get deep into the corruption cases, but you should know that the corruption cases probably would not hold weight in U.S. courts, not the charges, not the way in which the state witnesses were essentially blackmailed to becoming state witness. Not only have the issues of bribery and breach of trust, those crimes don't exist in the United States as they are defined in the cases against Netanyahu. And all the details of those cases were leaked to the media throughout the election cycle. And yet, despite all the efforts to keep Netanyahu out and even getting him out for a year, in the 5th election after Bennett resigned, not only did Netanyahu come back, but all of his loyal right-wing supporters received enough votes to actually, for the first time in those 5 elections, form a majority coalition. And the right wing won a 64-seat majority against the 46-seat minority of the left. And so you can imagine that the left-wing opposition that did everything that they could, including having these corruption cases, including having the media on their side, including having this protest movement moving for weeks and months. Not only did Netanyahu get back into power, but now for the first time, he actually had a full right-wing government. For the 15 years prior that Netanyahu was the prime minister, he always had a center or left-wing party together with him in the coalition. And Netanyahu has always preferred to govern from the center, except this time around, none of the center or left-wing parties were willing to sit with Netanyahu. So he had no choice but to go to his loyal right-wing allies, and they formed a right-wing government. So now not only was Netanyahu back, but they had no influence on any of Netanyahu's policies because now they're not in the government. So they're sitting in the backbenches of the opposition, and all the parties that are sitting to the right of Netanyahu that are now in see this government as a tremendous opportunity to, for the first time in decades, to be able to implement a full right-wing policy. And so this is what led to the issue of the judicial reforms, because the court in Israel is a self-selecting left-wing court. In the 1990s, the chairman, the president of the Supreme Court, Aaron Barak, underwent a judicial revolution, as he called it, in which he said that everything is justiciable. And so that means that any legislation, any policy that the government wants to implement, all of this can come before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court can decide that any of it is illegal. Now, the court, excuse me one second. The court under Barak also became an activist court in which they took on many cases. And according to Barak, not only is everything possibly justiciable, but everything should be justiciable. So they took on many, many cases, and the Israeli Supreme Court tries many more cases than many of the other courts in the Western world. The way that the Israelis, there's a lot of differences between the courts in the United States and in the state of Israel. The first is the way that the justices are selected. So in the United States, the way a justice is selected is he's nominated by the president of the United States, and then he's ratified by the Senate. And what this means is that over time, you'll have members of the Supreme Court that were appointed by Democrats, and you'll have members of the Supreme Court that are appointed by Republicans. Now, sometimes the Senate is not controlled by the same house as the presidency. And when that happens and a Supreme Court justice is nominated, then you're going to get a more moderate candidate because they have to be ratified by the Senate, which is controlled by the other party. So what you wind up having is a cross-section of justices from the right to the left and many moderates in between, in such case that most Americans feel that there are members of the court that represent them. Whether the majority is toward the right or towards the left, that can shift over time, but you have justices that represent a wide spectrum of the society. In the state of Israel, the way justices are selected is very different. You have a 9-member committee. The first 3 members of the committee are Supreme Court justices themselves. Now, in order to pass through the committee, you need to have 7 votes out of the 9-member committee. So if the Supreme Court sitting justices have 3 of the seats on the committee, what that means is that they already have a blocking veto on any candidate that they don't want, because they vote as a block. And if those 3 don't want a candidate, that candidate's not going to be on the court. The next 2 members of the committee belong to the Israeli Bar Association, which means that the lawyers are involved in picking the justices, which is wrong for several reasons. One, because the lawyers are trying their cases before the justices, and 2, because the lawyers want to be appointed justices. So by and large, the Bar Association votes in a block together, united block together with the Supreme Court justices. So now you already have 5 members of the committee that vote in a single block, not exclusively, but most of the time you have them voting together in a block. Now, the other 3 the other four members of the committee are politicians. One is the justice minister. One will be another minister from the government. You'll have one Knesset member from the government and another Knesset member from the opposition. So if the left wing is in power, then you'll already have, in addition to the five, you'll probably have three other ideologically aligned left-wing candidates. So that means that any candidate that the Supreme Court wants to pick, they can bring right through the committee because they already have 8 votes out of the 9, which is enough to pick a justice. If the right wing is in power, then you have a member of the opposition as part of the committee. So that means you already have 6 out of 9 of the members of the committee that are aligned, and you have 3 that belong to the right wing. So what happens is that you're not going to get an extreme left wing, but you're probably going to get a moderate candidate, because anybody that the Supreme Court doesn't want, they're going to be blocked from being on the court. So you have 15 justices in Israel, and by and large, this is a homogenous left-wing court in terms of their ideology. Not only that, but this country, Israel, is 50% plus what we call Mizrahi Jews, Jews of Sephardic or origin, or Jews that their ancestors lived in Arab lands, and yet the overwhelming majority of the court is Ashkenaz. So you have half the country feels that they're not represented. You have one member of the court that's Mizrahi. You have one member of the court who's religious. So you also have the religious in Israel, which represent a growing percentage of the population who feel that they're not adequately represented on the court. Now, in addition, the difference between the U.S. court and the Israeli court is the issue of standing. You do in the United States, in order to bring a case before a court, you have to be an injured party. And then when you bring a case because you have standing, that first goes to a lower court, and then it can advance to an appeals court. And then after that, it can appeal to the Supreme Court. But you have this issue where the one bringing the petition to the court is an injured party, and it goes through a progression. Now, because everything is justiciable in the Supreme Court and Israel's activist court, so the Supreme Court can hear any case that it wants. And not only can it hear any case that it wants at any time, but the one bringing the petition to the court does not have to be an injured party. They don't have to have standing in the case. So what ends up happening is that the Supreme Court actually colludes together with non-governmental organizations, many of which, by the way, receive foreign funding from the European Union and from other places, from different countries in Europe, and even some receive funding from the United States, that are bringing cases to Israel's Supreme Court with the knowledge of the court. The Supreme Court president then picks which 3 members of the committee which members of the court are going to hear the case. And based on the 3 members that are picked, you can almost know what the outcome of the case is going to be before the case is even tried. Now, Israel, unlike the United States, does not have a constitution. That means we do not have rights codified into law in Israel. In Israel, you have a lot of privileges. Privileges can look very similar to rights. They can mimic rights in many different ways. But the one difference between a privilege and a right is that a privilege can be suspended. And we saw that during COVID and other times. And so Israel does not have a constitution. So when you have a constitution, that means that the Supreme Court justices are limited in which cases they can hear, and also in the interpretation of the law in those cases. You have to judge on the basis of the Constitution. Now, there's some latitude there. You can judge on the basis of what the founding fathers of the Constitution believed when they wrote the Constitution. You could say, what does the Constitution mean today? But there's still limitations. In Israel, since you don't have a constitution, you don't have any judicial limits. So how does the court rule on a case in which there's no basis for how to rule? So according to Aaron Barak in his judicial revolution, he coined a term called reasonableness, which means that the court can take any issue, and then the justices themselves can decide whether they think that the law, policy, whatever that they're trying is reasonable or not. And if they decide that something's not reasonable, then it gets canceled. Now, another difference, a key difference in the legal system between the United States and Israel is the issue of the Attorney General. So in the United States, the Attorney General is appointed by the president as a member of the cabinet. And while the Attorney General does have some degree of independence, the Attorney General is appointed by the president in order to help the president achieve his policy agenda. In the state of Israel, it's different. The attorney general is a professional appointment picked by a committee, which is led by the justice minister at the time. The attorney general serves for a term of 6 years. And so the previous attorney general, Avichai Mandelblit, his term expired during this change coalition led by Naftali Bennett. And Gideon Sa'ar, who was a former member of the Likud, who actually challenged Netanyahu for the leadership of the Likud and lost by a tremendous landslide, and then defected out of the Likud party and joined the change government. He was the justice minister that actually led the appointment of a attorney general, which is Gali Barav Miara, who in her nature is against the continued rule of Netanyahu. And so Netanyahu inherited an anti-Netanyahu attorney general. And not only does the attorney general not work for the prime minister, and not only can the attorney general refuse actually to defend the government before the court, but according to the judicial revolution of Aaron Barak and the Supreme Court, the legal opinion of the attorney general in Israel is legally binding on the government. So it's not an opinion at all. It's actually a ruling on the government. So anytime the government wants to advance a law or wants to advance a policy, the attorney general can on their own determine that policy or legislation is illegal, and she can halt it. And that is legally binding on the government according to the court. So essentially, not only does the attorney general not work for the prime minister, but the prime minister works at the beck and call of the attorney general. And in addition to that, each ministry has a legal advisor, and the legal advisor reports to the attorney general. So you have a mini attorney general inside each one of the government ministries. So these are just some of the reasons why the right wing wants to reform the court, because they are not able to advance a policy agenda even when they have the votes to form a majority coalition. So almost every policy that this government has tried to advance, the attorney general weighs in and says, you cannot do that. It is illegal. Not only that, but the attorney general actually put a conflict of interest arrangement on Netanyahu, saying that because Netanyahu was on trial, okay, and the trial could, at a later date, if convicted, could advance to an appeals court and then could advance to the Supreme Court. And so if Netanyahu changes the way that justices are selected, that case could advance to the Supreme Court, and then later there would be Supreme Court justices that might hear his case. So therefore, Netanyahu was in a conflict of interest. And according to this arrangement that was drawn up by the attorney general, Netanyahu, as part of this conflict of interest arrangement, was not allowed to deal with the issue of judicial reforms. So his justice minister, Yariv Levin, and also the head of the Knesset Law and Constitution Committee, Simcha Rothman, were the two that were spearheading the issue of legal reforms in Israel, judicial reforms, and Netanyahu was completely silent. There was a gag order on him. He couldn't utter a word about it. And this was actually a big part of the problem, because Netanyahu was trying to advance policies that turned out to be much more controversial than he anticipated in the beginning, and yet he wasn't allowed to even talk about them. Now, what changed, because he has talked about them in the last a week, is that the government passed a new law which basically said that the Supreme Court cannot force the prime minister to step out of office. So which means that Netanyahu now felt free that the Supreme Court could not essentially choke Netanyahu for violating his conflict of interest agreement. Meanwhile, there is a petition that's gone to the court on the violation of the conflict of interest agreement, and that will be Netanyahu and the attorney general will be forced to address that in the coming weeks. The court also has canceled commercial contracts. So if you've been paying attention over the last several years, Israel's actually found a lot of natural gas off the Mediterranean coast. And in order to exploit that gas, the Israeli government had to contract with a U.S. company, Noble Energy, in order to bring their know-how and their equipment in to get the gas out of the ground. So they signed the contract with Noble Energy, and as part of the contract, they locked the price of natural gas for 10 years. Why did they do that? Because Noble Energy wanted to make sure that they'll make back their investment within a 10-year period. So they wanted the price of natural gas to be locked. They negotiated that with the government in return for billions of dollars of investment into this infrastructure, which would be very profitable for the state of Israel. The Supreme Court came in on a petition by an NGO to basically say that the contract was illegal, and they voided the contract that the government had signed with Noble Energy because they determined that it was not reasonable. So this is how the court can actually interfere. And yet at the same time, the court has not really been consistent, because if you remember, at the very, very end of the changed government, when Yair Lapid was serving as the interim prime minister just a few weeks before the election, Lapid signed a deal with Lebanon to essentially to change the maritime border between Israel and Lebanon, which would give a major natural gas reserve over to the Lebanese. And the petition came to the court saying that an interim government does not have, in law, is very limited in what it's allowed to perform, and does not have a mandate to sign a deal to change Israel's maritime border and to give a major national asset over to a country in which it doesn't even have diplomatic relations. And the court said, well, no, we're not going to rule on that. It's an issue of national security. At the same time, also, the government of Israel had passed a law in the previous government saying that tax revenues collected on behalf of the Palestinian Authority would not be transferred over to the Palestinian Authority because of the pay-for-slay policy, which means that if the Palestinian Authority is basically paying money to terrorists sitting in Israeli jails, or giving money to the families of quote-unquote martyrs killed in the act of first-degree murder, so Israel's not going to transfer those sums of money over to the Palestinian Authority. They're going to withhold those funds. So the last government, what they did in order to do a workaround to the law, was that they loaned the same amount of money to the Palestinian Authority and used the amounts that they had collected as collateral in case the Palestinian Authority didn't pay back the loan. So there was a petition that went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, yeah, we refuse to hear that petition. So the right wing has felt that the court's working against it. You can't change the court. You can't get you can't get any right-wing justices onto the court. And the court's basically the court exists as a left-wing check against right-wing policies. In the absence of a constitution, that the left-wing court has determined that it's the protector of Israeli democracy. So what did the government want to do? They wanted to reform the way the selection committee was composed, making the committee up to 11 members and making sure that the coalition would have a majority. This way, if you have a right-wing government, that they could be the ones to nominate for the Supreme Court, which, by the way, if you have a left-wing government, then they would be the ones that would nominate. And over time, you'd have a situation similar to the United States, where you would get some right-wing appointed justices and some left-wing appointed justices. Meanwhile, even if the right wing did appoint justices, you have 15 justices, most of whom are to the left. So it would take many years, probably 10 to 20 years to create that balance on the court. They wanted to enforce the issue of standing. They wanted to cancel the issue of reasonability. They wanted to divide up the position of the attorney general and make it that the attorney general's position and that of the legal advisors are legal opinions that the government can take and decide whether or not they want to adhere to those opinions, or if they want to proceed against the caution of the attorney general. And then on top of that was probably the most controversial reform that the government wanted to enact, and that was called a Knesset override clause. The override clause would give the parliament, the Knesset, the opportunity to override a decision of the Supreme Court with a simple majority. Now, of all the reforms, this one really it went too far for many people. They said it can't just be that the parliament will essentially render the court useless by canceling its laws. Two wrongs don't make a right. And I do believe that many in the right wing that were advancing the judicial reforms would have been willing to take the override either completely off the table, or to turn the override from a simple majority into a supermajority of, let's say, 70 or 80. And so they put that on the table. That was sort of like the smoking gun on the table. And this is the one of the reforms that most of the opposition latched onto and said that the government was going too far. Now, in addition to this, Yeah, I would like to mention with regard to the conflict of interest, the Attorney General herself is in a conflict of interest because the government wants to change the confines of her position, to divide up the responsibilities into 3 separate jobs, and also to nullify her legal authority. So you have a situation in which the court themselves is in a conflict of interest with regard to the judicial reforms, and also the Attorney General is in a conflict of interest with regard to the judicial reforms. So why the protests? Really what this has to do with is even much more than the override clause is really competing visions of what the country is. You have a right-wing government, which is by and large nationalist in nature, traditionalist in terms of Jewish faith and tradition, sees Israel as a nation that stands alone, with unique challenges in the region, versus a sort of left-wing minority of the country, which is by and large secular, and which really views Israel as a sort of like secular bastion, an extension of Western Europe on the Eastern Mediterranean. So you have this sort of culture clash, which is taking place between the secular and modern vision of Israel on the Israeli left and the more traditional vision of Israel on the Israeli right. And the left, which recognizes that now that they've lost the government, has a fully right-wing government in power that can advance any legislation that could actually change the fabric of the state of Israel in law. They said that this is too much for them, and these are the ones that had campaigned so hard against Netanyahu. And so now Netanyahu gets to pass all the laws that he and his partners want to pass. So they have to put their foot in the sand with regard to protecting the Supreme Court. In addition, the government, when they came into power, they started advancing some laws that were pretty controversial. So, for example, Netanyahu's one of his coalition partners, Aryeh Deri, was recently convicted on a breach of trust issue. In the past, he had been convicted of tax fraud, and Netanyahu appointed him as the interior minister and also the minister of health. And the court ruled that it was unreasonable for Deri to serve as a minister in the government because he, in exchange for a suspended sentence that he received, he essentially promised to resign his post from the government. And only one election cycle later, he was there running again. So the court said that he had violated his deal. And they said it was unreasonable for a minister to serve. Now, by the way, he is allowed to serve as a member of the Knesset. He could even serve as the speaker of the Knesset, and he could even serve as the prime minister according to the law. But you have this inconsistency in the law where it is okay to be a parliamentarian, but it's not okay to be a minister. So what the government wanted to do was to legislate and say that the court cannot intervene in who the prime minister, which member of Knesset the prime minister wants to assign to a ministry. In addition, the Likud advanced a law which said that politicians could accept gifts up to an amount of $270,000 or so, which is exactly the amount that Netanyahu received in order to pay for some of his legal counsel from one of his cousins. So you had a few of these laws passed. Another bill was put on the table which said that the court cannot force the prime minister out of office. So these were all seen as personal laws, which really it minimized the amount of trust that many Israelis had in the legislative process of the coalition, and that led them to look at the judicial reforms as more of a power grab than an actual issue that is fundamental to the advance of democracy in the country. So, who's behind the protest movement? Now, this movement is one of the most well-funded campaigns in Israeli history. There are literally tens of millions of dollars being spent every week on these protests. So we're talking about billboards being printed with black fists calling on Israelis to oppose the dictaforma, the dictatorship reforms that are being advanced by the coalition, saying that Israelis have to oppose what's going on in the country without having an organizing an organizing member with their name on the bottom of the billboards. There's signs being passed out. There's these handmade uniforms that are being passed out, and people are being bused to protests for free. And these buses cost a lot of money. And so literally tens of millions of dollars are being spent every week on organizing all of these protests. Now, one of the groups that's behind the protest movement is the Movement for Quality Government. To their credit, they have protested government corruption for decades, both from the left and the right. But Eliyav Shraga, the head of the Movement for Quality Government, decided long ago that, in his view, Netanyahu was not fit to serve as prime minister. He has brought many, many petitions almost on a regular basis to the Supreme Court against Netanyahu, and that continues to this day. So now you have the same person who is petitioning the Supreme Court, leading the protests. It should also be noted that the Movement for Quality Government has received, openly acknowledged, has received at least $30,000 from the U.S. State Department for what they call educational activities. So we don't know exactly what the educational activities are, but and it's not a very large sum of money, but yes, the U.S. State Department has given money to an organization which is petitioning the Supreme Court against the prime minister, while at the same time leading the protests publicly against the prime minister. You have the head of the opposition, Yair Lapid, a champion of the protests. You have Ehud Barak, former prime minister, also calling for the protests, calling for Netanyahu to be out of office. And you have really the entire opposition to Netanyahu behind the protests. But what's actually happened in the last weeks has been a shift where you have members of the Israeli center right actually joining the protests. As the protests get bigger and bigger, you have members of the center right who are acknowledging that judicial reform, while necessary, is controversial, and you can't just ram it through because you have 64 votes, and you can't just pass whatever you want on something that's so fundamental to the fabric of the country if you don't have buy-in from this very loud and vocal majority. And this left-wing majority is not just left-wing minority, rather, is not just a loud and vocal minority. They also, they control many of the key institutions. Let's not forget that the left wing controlled the state of Israel for the first 30 years of its existence, when Ben Gurion and Golda Meir and others were the prime minister. And so the left wing set up most of the institutions in the country. And so what you have is left wing controlling the top echelons of the military. You have the left wing controlling most of the Israeli media. You have the left wing controlling most of the Israeli academia, and you have the left wing controlling the court, and you have the left wing controlling the labor union. So it's and not only that, the left wing is more economically advanced, let's just say, than some of the other elements of society. So you have the wealthier and the more powerful elements of the society who are now in the minority. But if they're opposed to something in a united front, that it's very hard to do that. And what's happened is that there's actually been a major miscalculation on the part of Netanyahu and Yariv Levin, the justice minister, and Simcha Rothman. They really thought that that there would be kicking and screaming from the opposition, but they did not recognize that a mass protest movement could be established in the country, and that it would take on such great momentum at such speed. And that's really what's happened in the coming weeks. And so what you've actually had is members of the Israeli center right really calling for the reforms to be at least paused in order to get some degree of consensus between the right and the left. They really underestimated the power of these left-wing institutions, which culminated today with the shutdown, general strike of the labor union. They thought that they could get these reforms passed without really launching a major campaign to explain each reform one by one and to try to get buy-in from academics and legal scholars and members of the opposition, even some of them, on specifics of the judicial reform package. They miscalculated. Bibi miscalculated in the sense that he allowed Rothman and Levin to advance the judicial reforms while he himself stayed silent on account of this gag order. And it took many, many weeks for Netanyahu to figure out a way in which he felt comfortable to sort of violate this gag order. And he gave a speech to the nation about a week ago, end of last week, calling for calm and saying that he was in charge. But really, it was a day late and a dollar short in terms of what would have needed to happen to calm the tensions and not let them to get to that point. And then what wound up happening is that not only did members of the center right start to join the protest, but some of the more moderate members of Netanyahu's own Likud party, including the defense minister Yoav Gallant, who I mentioned, former Netanyahu ally and Knesset Speaker Yuli Edelstein, who said that he wasn't going to vote for the reforms. Then you had a few other members of the Likud, Nir Barkat, Avi Dichter, Miki Zohar, David Bitan, all saying that, okay, we will support the prime minister, but maybe he should slow it down. So what wound up happening is that Netanyahu started to lose the votes, essentially, within his own coalition for the reforms. And you have hundreds of thousands of people in the street. And you have this protest movement just growing and growing and growing out of control. Now, in addition to that, what we saw is that the protest movement actually started to break many of the social codes in Israel. You had former prime ministers like Ehud Barak on CNN basically opposing the government's policies. You had members of the opposition from the very beginning when the protest started saying that these protests will end in violence and saying that Netanyahu was dragging the country into a civil war. And you can oppose Netanyahu on many grounds, but he's never called for a civil war, and he doesn't make inflammatory statements by and large. He's very diplomatic in the way he speaks. He speaks in a responsible fashion, but the opposition to the judicial reform was speaking in very incendiary language. We had the president of Israel, Yitzhak Herzog, saying that twice before, when Israel had commonwealths, they didn't make it to the 80th year. And he was afraid that now Israel in its 75th year would not make it till its 80th year. And then 2 days later, you had Hassan Nasrallah, the chief of Hezbollah in Lebanon, quoting Herzog in his speech to Hezbollah followers, saying, even the president of Israel says that Israel's not going to make it till its 80th birthday. You had the protest movement essentially lobbying businesses to take their money out of Israel. So you had the protest movement promoting BDS. And Israel's been fighting BDS for the last 10 plus years. And now you have the left-wing opposition promoting BDS. You had the opposition lobbying diaspora Jewry to staunchly oppose Israeli government policy, which is the first time that you have the opposition lobbying American Jewry. And then you had the opposition basically urging reservists in the military and Air Force pilots to basically refuse to serve, not because they disagree with specific orders that they were given to protect the country, but because they opposed the judicial reform. They opposed the political process. You also had, for the first time, we just saw this in the UK. You have protests against Netanyahu when he was going to a foreign country. So they've actually broken this code here too, where they say that when an Israeli prime minister travels to another country, that there should be a protest against him. And what happens is that all of these moves are essentially cutting off your nose to spite your face if you're the opposition. Like, does the left wing think that if business owners take their money out of Israel, that then all of a sudden, if let's say Yair Lapid becomes the prime minister, that they're going to now reinvest their money into Israel? If they scream that Israel is now fascist and is no longer a democracy, do they think that the people that see those headlines and say, yeah, Israel's not a democracy, that they're going to change their minds all of a sudden if the left wing gets back into power? Do they think that that reservists in the army are only going to oppose judicial reforms, or have they now politicized the military and created a situation when anytime somebody disagrees with a policy, that they now have a justification not to serve in the defense? And let's remember that in 2005, when the IDF was called upon to uproot Jews from Jewish communities in Gaza and Gush Katif, that you had right-wing members of the military showing up to perform these orders, crying as they were doing it, because they said that it's more important that the IDF be unified and that they maintain and they keep any order that they're given. And now, even when they oppose the specific order that they were given, and here they're not opposing a specific military order, they're just opposing a political action. So you have all these different, and the same thing with the protests. They think that if Benny Gantz or Yair Lapid becomes prime minister, and then one of them goes to the UK or another country, that suddenly there's not going to be protests? Or have they created a situation in which people think now you can protest when an Israeli prime minister goes to another country? So you have a lot of these social codes, these silent understandings, all broken. And the dangers now are that even though Bibi's called to pause the legislation, that the protest movement actually could continue. We're seeing for the first time a counter-protest movement taking place in Jerusalem, where you're actually pitting pro-reform protesters against anti-reform protesters, basically on the same street, and creating a very, very tense situation. I actually personally saw, while walking on one of the streets in Jerusalem just a few weeks ago, an Antifa Jerusalem sticker on a street sign. So you don't know what type of elements are here, and if you have agitators like Antifa that are roaming around, and you don't know what side of the street they could be on, but if you have the opposition to the reforms saying that this is going to end in violence and this is going to end in civil war, and then you see that agent provocateurs like Antifa are in the country, you don't really know where this is going to end up. And so in the last several days, Bibi was in a very, very tough place, because on the one hand, he had members of his own government like Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich to his right, saying that they joined the government because they were promised that there was going to be certain policies, including judicial reform. And if Netanyahu was not going to advance judicial reform, then they were going to bolt the government, which would leave Netanyahu without a coalition. And then at the same time, you have moderate members of the Likud, including the defense minister, who Netanyahu just had to fire, who are calling for a pause in the reforms and saying that they're not going to vote with the reforms. So Netanyahu was sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't. If he paused the reforms, he risked losing his members to the right, and if he advanced the reforms, he risked losing the more moderate members of his coalition. So Netanyahu basically gave an address just, I guess at this point, not even 2 hours ago, where he basically said that he is going to pause the reforms. He said, and I quote, "There's an extreme minority that is ready to tear our country into parts. It tends towards violence. It ignites fire. It threatens to harm elected officials. It talks about civil war. It calls for insubordination, which is a terrible crime." He basically said that insubordination cannot exist in the IDF. And he said insubordination by one side will bring about insubordination on the other side. And he's called insubordination the end of our state. So he demanded that security forces and IDF commanders oppose this phenomenon and to stop it. He had acknowledged that for 3 months he's called for dialogue, and he has called for the opposition to sit down with him in dialogue. They've refused to do so until now. He said, "Remember, we're not facing enemies. We are facing our brothers." And he acknowledges that I say here and now, we must not have a civil war. And that was the first time that he acknowledged that this is actually going to a bad place, and even used the terminology of civil war. He said, "We're now on the path towards a very dangerous collision in Israeli society, which jeopardizes the basic unity between us. And such a crisis obligates all of us to act responsibility." And so he said that he decided to postpone the second and third readings of these laws in order to give time to try to reach a wide agreement on the legislation in the next session of the Knesset. He gave this address after he reached an agreement with Itamar Ben-Gvir, who had threatened earlier in the day to resign and crash Netanyahu's own government. And basically Ben-Gvir acquiesced to allow this process to reconvene after the beginning of the next Knesset session. And he did that in exchange for a promise from Netanyahu to to fast track the establishment of a National Guard, which he said will be under the authority of Ben-Gvir as the National Security Minister. And we will see in the coming weeks whether the Attorney General says that that's legal, whether the Supreme Court says that's illegal, and whether that actually happens. So it does look like Netanyahu has sort of managed to contain the damage for the moment. The labor union said that they called off their general strike. Benny Gantz, who was one of the chief opponents of Netanyahu in the election cycles and actually formed a unity government with him for a very short period of time, he called Netanyahu's decision to delay the overhaul, quote, better late than never. And he said that he will be willing to enter into negotiations with the coalition at the president's residence, quote, with an open heart, not to defeat, but to agree. And he did say that he promises to hear the concerns of those in favor of overhaul, and said that he aims to improve governability and checks and balances. He says no to civil war, no to divisions, yes to agreement and to dialogue. And even Yair Lapid, who was the most vocal of the opponents, says that if the legislation really does stop genuinely and totally, we're ready to start genuine dialogue at the president's residence. Although he did warn that, he, quote, we've had a bad experience in the past, and so first we'll need to make sure that there's no tricks or bluffing here. So this is the situation that we're in. We don't really know if Netanyahu will succeed in lowering the temperature here. Just in the last couple of days before Netanyahu's speech, you had the opposition for the first time, I think, really getting to the heart of what their protest was all about. And they were essentially calling for Netanyahu to resign, which I think is actually their true goal, more than the goal of opposing judicial reforms. And so we will see the protest movement. They have vowed to keep going. So, we're going to have to all watch and wait and see exactly what happens with regard to the temperature in Israel and how the process of judicial reforms may or may not proceed in the coming weeks or months, and if Netanyahu will be able to glue his coalition together and stave off what would be a sixth election in about 4 years' time, which at this point it's not a definite eventuality, but it's definitely one of the realistic possibilities that we might even find this government collapsing at some point and heading to another election if Netanyahu can't figure out a way to glue it together. I'm going to try to look here some of the questions. I think that there's a lot. Maybe that there's looks like I've answered a lot of them. Just looking through them quickly. Yeah, so one of the questions here is, what action should we American Jews take at this time to be supportive to our brethren in Israel? I think it's a very important question. And I think in general, there needs to be really reconciliation that takes place between Jews and Israel, between the right and the left, and between Israelis and the diaspora. We have to recognize that the state of Israel and the Jewish people are one big family, and you can have disagreements, but we're, in the end of the day, we're all brothers and sisters. I think it's very important that American Jews will show their support for the state of Israel, especially in this moment. You had a lot of leaders of the American Jewish community really adamantly opposing the judicial reforms in a way that we've not really seen diaspora Jewry oppose policies of the state of Israel. And it's a very bad precedent. I think that it would be very important for American Jewish leaders now to sort of call for reconciliation and to say that, on the one hand, while they thought that the judicial reforms went too far, that maybe they themselves went too far, and try to open up a meaningful dialogue together with Israel, especially as Israel goes into its 75th birthday, which is coming up with Yom Ha'atzmaut and Independence Day in just under a month from now. Okay, and I'm looking here. I think we've gotten to most of the questions. So I want to thank you all for your time and your energy. Please do sign up for the daily email at jns.org. We're sending email to hundreds of thousands of people every day. Come to the website, jns.org. Please try to make that your primary home. We do try to do a good job of breaking down what's taking place in Israel and in the Jewish world, dealing with anti-Semitism and BDS and campus intimidation and the U.S.-Israel relationship, Israeli diaspora relations on a daily basis, and giving you, a lot of context to formulate your own opinions on what's happening. So I do want to thank you all for joining us, and look forward to speaking with you again soon.